So yeah, what I'm going to present here is something that we've been working on for, I'd say, about 2 years, about trying to understand self-citations a bit better. The title is a bit provocative in the sense that I must say I don't come up with such a clear answer, but let's say that I point the data point in a direction that we'll see in a couple of minutes. And this is done with my postdoc, Philippe Vincent Larivière, Cassidy Sugimoto, who you know all, I guess, very well, and then myself. So I'll start with a bit on the rise, and this is stuff that will probably not be new for most of you guys, but the rise in research evaluation, and in that context, the criticism of citation analysis. Then I'll play around a couple of misconceptions around self-citations, and then I'll move to basically the two analyses that are kind of the heart of the research. Looking at first how self-citations and self-reference evolve throughout the career of individuals. And then looking at the similarity between citing and cited paper as a function of whether these papers are actually self-cited or not. And then we're going to conclude. And don't hesitate to ask questions in the chat during the talk. I will try to keep an eye on that if there's anything that is unclear. So of course, as you know, there's a growth in research evaluation that's based on bibliometrics. In some places, it has totally replaced peer review. In some others, it serves as a complement. It's of course at the heart of all of the university rankings that our administrators care so much about. And all of that has kind of changed the incentive structure of academia. So researchers now have to publish, and it's kind of a crucial element, and we don't have to go that far in the past to see examples of researchers that did not feel that pressure. One could say that nowadays, even if you don't find anything, you actually have to publish something. You need to publish to exist in the scientific community. And then we can contrast that with Peter Higgs, who basically published his last paper in 1979, even though he continued to go to meetings, etc., because basically he considered that he didn't have anything to contribute anymore to science, at least not directly in the form of scholarly papers. So I think that serves quite as a good counterexample that reminds us that we don't win the Nobel Prize or we don't cure COVID just because we have a certain number of papers. We only need one paper, one discovery to change the course of the world. One, of course, extreme example of that are all of the cash per publication policies, especially in China, but China is not the only country that has that. And what's striking over time is that in China, for instance, it's increasingly based on quartile or journal impact factor value. So of course, the higher the impact factor, the higher the bonus that you're gonna get. Of course, all of that increase in pressures to publish has led to researchers being actually more productive. But what's interesting here is that it kind of also depends how we measure it. So when we look at full counting, which is basically researchers' CVs in a way, well, indeed, there's an increase in researchers' productivity. Researchers are publishing more and more at a certain career point. In that case, we were looking at the first 15 years of their careers. When you look at fractional counting, well, it's not that clear, which means that individually researchers are more productive or they have their names on more papers, but collectively it's relatively stable in the sense that the amount of people leads to a certain amount of paper, and that's quite, it has been at least relatively stable over the last century. So in the context of research evaluation, there's been, and this is something that's not new, you probably all know the McRoberts and McRoberts criticism that dates from the 1980s of citation analysis. So there's many of those criticisms. We'll go through them, and of course the last one will be self-citation, and that will be the one we'll look at with in more details. So of course the first element is that it takes time for citation to accumulate. There's a delay in the reception of those citations. Of course, most of us know that this is normal and that we need to wait a couple of years. There's also uncited influences. So there's papers that may have influenced a given piece, but that don't get cited. An extreme example would be obliteration by incorporation, where it's something that is taken for granted and not cited anymore. There's, of course, the presence of negative citation, which is something that historically has been studied with small micro level analysis, and that nowadays we're able to look at more at a large scale using full text analysis. We've been working on that with a couple of our colleagues. This was actually led by Dakota Murray, who's a new doctor, actually. He just defended his thesis a couple of months ago. And basically, we use the entire full text of Elsevier papers, trying to measure not negative citation, but instances of disagreement. And what is quite striking, well, there's two things. The first thing is that citations that have an element of disagreement are very, very small in the literature. Basically, less than 1% of the cited references that we analyzed at those instances. And this was true in our field. And the other element is how the amount of disagreement by field kind of follows Auguste Comte's hierarchy of disciplines, where basically disciplines that are more complex and that have less consensus, like the social sciences and humanities, have much higher rates of disagreement than math and computer science and physics, where it's actually less complex. I mean, it doesn't mean that it's easier. It's just that the phenomena that they're looking at are less complex and more predictable than social phenomena. And in those fields, there's actually more consensus. So globally, talking about negative citations, it's not so much of a strong criticism of citation analysis because there's very few of them in the literature. And it's also quite stable over time, except in physics and engineering. I must say that we didn't find a clear reason why physics and engineering was actually increasingly in agreement. So there was a decrease in the disagreements in the data. And we still don't have it. Your hypotheses are as good as mine. I'm happy to hear them if you have any. Then, of course, there's a presence of perfunctory citations, which are citations that are made and that would not really be necessary. And that one way of looking at that is actually the places in scholarly documents where we are actually citing. So this is from a piece from a couple of years ago, where basically we show that most references are in the introduction to basically lay the background and explain why we are doing a specific study. It could be argued that there's a certain proportion of those references which are more contextual, that are not necessarily necessary to understand the piece of research, and that references that are actually more engaged with in the discussion and conclusion are probably a bit more important. So bottom line, not all references are equal, but it's debatable in the end if you indeed need those contextual citations in the beginning. Another element that we hear often is that most papers are uncited, which is of course not true, as most of you know. Of course, again, it takes time for citation to accumulate. So when a paper is published, of course, it's not cited yet. So it takes time for these citations to accumulate. But after a couple of years, the vast majority of papers are cited. And this is true of almost all fields, except in arts and humanities, where basically there's a huge role of books, which of course are not taken into account in those analyses. As well as the fact that those disciplines are not cumulative. So the act of citing doesn't mean the same thing. There's of course citation cartels, where basically there would be colleagues citing you, you would cite them, and globally you would all be more cited. And then the question of self-citation. And so self-citation can be looked at from many angles, but they can be looked at the journal level, at the national level, at the paper level, and then at the researcher level. At the journal level, well, we've seen an increase for certain journals of the self-citations, of their own self-citation that fall within the journal impact factor window. So that would fall into what we may call questionable research practices, where these journals are basically trying to increase their journal impact factor. So there's indeed an increase of those practices. National self-citation is something that has always been there. So for basically every country, and that's the diagonal here, researchers are more likely to cite papers from other institutions or other researchers from the same country. And now we fall into self-citations at the individual level. And so there's basically two points of view or two hypotheses or two conceptions of what self-citations are. For some, it's just a normal feature of research activity. So researchers don't change topic every minute. They basically work on the same topic or on similar topics over the course of their career. And so it's normal that they will actually cite their previous work once they continue their work. And this is, of course, more frequent in smaller fields than in bigger fields. And in that conception, we also need to keep in mind that to self-cite yourself, you need to publish an additional article that will go through peer review, etc. So there are constraints in a way to self-citation. It's not the same as self-tweeting your own pieces, where basically there's no guardian or any gatekeeper. So in that conception, self-citations could be considered in research evaluation because they are a normal feature of research activity. There's also another conception where self-citations are more of a deviant behavior. And so in that conception, having an impact means influencing others, not influencing yourself. So your own self-citations should not be taken into account. Those self-citations are made just in order to increase one's scholarly impact. And so in that context, self-citation should be excluded from research evaluation. So what we'll try to get at is, well, is it deviant, or is it something that is actually more of a normal feature of research activity? Of course, there's extreme examples of self-citations. And this, of course, leads to, how can I say that? It gives bad press to citation analysis. So you have an example here of a paper where basically the paper has 182 words and 212 references, and all of the 2012 references are to the first author of the citing paper. So yeah, that's a bit crazy, but I believe this has also been published in a bit of a, if not predatory, a bit of a deviant journal. So before entering into the analysis itself, we need to distinguish a couple of things. The first thing is that self-citations are different from self-references. And in order to understand the mechanisms at stake, we need to distinguish those two analyses. So self-citation, what is it? Well, it's of all of the citations that I've received, what is the percentage that was made by the author? In the case of the self-references, it's of all of the references that I've made that actually were made by that given author. So it has the same numerator, which is the overlap between citing and cited papers that have the same name, but it has a different denominator and also should be interpreted differently. And as we'll see, they obey to totally different logic and they evolve differently over the time career of researchers. And so if we want to understand deviant behavior, we need to look at self-references, because it's only self-references that are fully dependent on authors' referencing practices. I don't control the amount of time I'm going to be cited, but I do control what's in my own paper's reference lists. So just to make sure that we get that, basically, all of the references that I made 1,000 references. I've been citing my own work 100 times in all those references. That means that my percentage of self-references is 10%. Then all of the citations that I've received, that's 500, because I'm less cited than the amount of references that I've made. I've cited myself, again, 100 times, it's the same number, it's the same references. And so my percentage of self-citations is of 20%. So the other conceptual issue is that at what level do we compile those self-citations? So about 2 years ago, and this was one of the triggers for that piece, there was a paper in PLOS Biology by John Ioannidis and some of our good colleagues that basically made a list of many researchers, more than 100,000, if I remember correctly, and then add their self-citation rates. The way self-citation was compiled, that was deeply problematic because it was not compiled at the researcher level, but at the paper level, and then applied to individuals. So basically, in that list, you had a researcher whose name was Michael Gratzer, who had received 222,000 citations. Of course, more than 16,000 were considered as his own self-citations. And of course, it was not himself making those self-citations, it was co-authors of his paper. So that's the issue with compiling self-citations at the paper level, as it's basically compiled on the Web of Science, and then applying that to individuals, because in that case, you are applying, you are actually considering your co-authors' citations of a given paper as being yourself self-citing it. So just to make sure that we understand this distinction properly, there's a paper by Rodrigo and I. It's the citing paper. And in that paper, we are citing a previous paper by Rodrigo. When we analyze that at the paper level, it's a self-reference or a self-citation because there's an overlap between one of the authors of the citing and of the cited paper. But then when we compile things at the author level, it's actually a self-reference for Rodrigo. It's also a self-citation for Rodrigo, but for myself, it's an external reference. I'm citing in that piece of paper on which I am not a co-author, so should not be considered as a self-reference. And in the case of Ted Van Leeuwen and Maria Bordons, who are the co-authors of the cited papers, it should not be considered as a self-citation because they had nothing to do with that choice. So in order to understand self-citation, you got it, we need to look at individuals and we need to perform the self-citation, self-reference level, not at the paper level, but at the individual level. But for that, it means that we need to have author disambiguation. It means that we need to have a way of actually knowing which John Smith or which Rodrigo is the right one. That's the big challenge. So going to those research questions, what are the dynamics of self-citation and self-references? How do those self-citation, self-reference evolves as a function of the career? And the sub-question here is, can you become rich with self-citations? So can people basically inflate their numbers in a meaningful manner using self-citations and self-references? Second question is, how similar are citing and cited papers? And so what we're trying to get at with that second part is, if self-citations are a deviant behavior, then the self-cited paper should be less relevant or more distant to the citing paper than non-self-citations. And again, this is a work in progress. I'm still debating whether it's actually the case, and you'll see when we go to the results. So in terms of methods, we needed large-scale disambiguated data, so we relied on the automatic disambiguation algorithm developed at CWTS. It's not perfect, but it works relatively well. It mostly has a splitting problem, which means that it sometimes splits one individual into a couple of clusters or a couple of entities based on their citation rates. That's the limitation, but globally it works fine. We have data for about 40 years, so 1980 to 2018. So that's about 60 million papers and close to 900 million citation linkages. The self-citation and self-references are compiled at the individual researcher level, and career age was determined by year of first publication. And then we're looking at 4 types of citations or self-references. The first type is direct self-citation. So I cite a paper on which I'm a co-author. That's degree 0. Then we look at co-author self-citation. So those are co-authors of the papers that actually cite the paper. Collaborator citation. So it's basically former collaborators over the 5 previous years that cite the paper. So it's a bit of a network measurement. And then external citations. So it's all of the other citations or references than the three that are above. Okay, so first result, and this is something that I find really interesting, is the difference between self-references and self-citations over the course of the career of researcher. And let's look at the curve for medical science. So basically all disciplines follow the same pattern, but there's more papers in medical sciences, so trends are a bit more stable than arts and humanities, for instance. So what we see there is that when researchers begin their career, their proportion of self-citations is the highest. Why? Because no one knows their work yet. So when someone starts their career, they're going to be the first to build on that work. And then over time, and especially after like 5 or 6 years, it really drops dramatically and then decreases, let's say, at a different pace. So there's basically two phases there. A sharp decline in the first 6 years, and then a slower decline over the next 30-something years. So, and again, this totally makes sense. You start your career, no one knows your work, you're going to be the first one to cite it. Then after 5 years, you get a bit more known, but then you also receive more citations globally, so that increases your denominator, and so the proportion of self-citations continues to drop. So when we think about expected values of self-citations, older scholars should have a much lower expected value there than younger scholars. So if we want to find deviant behavior, we need to take into account age. Now you see that self-references behave in a totally different manner. And of course, that totally makes sense also, because when you start your career, you have none of your previous work to cite because you have written basically nothing. So the more you age, and again, it kind of follows the same path, but inversely, your first 5 years, there's a sharp increase in the place that your own work takes in your own references list. And then it continues to increase, but at a bit of a slower rate. So for a younger scholar, having a low proportion of self-references is very normal. For an older scholar, well, expected values in medicine would be around 10%. So I think that figure is really interesting because again, it exemplifies how we really need to distinguish the two if we want to understand those behaviors. Then, of course, when we complexify things a bit, well, we see that, well, direct citation there and direct references basically show the same thing as others. But what's interesting is the collaborators' citations. So both from a citation and references point of view, those increase over academic age. And of course, it's a function of the network that is being created over time. But yeah, there's not that much, I think, to infer from the more detailed analysis of the other types of citations. Now we wanted to look at self-citations as a function of age of cited document to kind of get an idea that, well, are the trends due to researchers having access to this work faster or because it's their own? And so it kind of is the case. So basically, direct citations, so individual self-citations, they peak faster and they decline faster. So of course, there's an accessibility or awareness effect there. Then co-authors peak just a bit after. Then interestingly, external citations are not the ones that have the, let's say, the oldest aspects. It's actually collaborators self-citations that actually take more space. So there's indeed not a recency, but an awareness effect in those self-citations. So self-citations are younger than non-self-citations. Now looking at whether researchers can become rich, so to say, with self-citations. So what's the effect on the H-index of including the different levels of self-citation? So on top, you have the absolute difference between a an H-index here that includes all types of cited references, an H-index that includes only direct and co-author self-citation, and an H-index that includes only individual direct citations. And you have here the relative difference. And so what's quite striking is that for all fields, direct self-citations have actually a very moderate effect of about 3 to 5% on the H-index. And that effect is actually gets relatively stable once a certain threshold of an H-index, which is relatively low, at about 5 to 10%, depending on the field. So by self-citing your work, you basically increase your H-index of 5%, roughly. And there doesn't seem to be a compound effect there. It's relatively stable as a function of your overall observed H-index. But what's really interesting there is that what has the biggest effect, and this is where the percentage actually increases as a function of the observed H-index, is the co-authors and collaborators citations. So those indeed have a strong effect on the H-index. So in the end, to conclude on that, researchers don't get directly rich by self-citing their work. They don't really increase their H-index that much, but it's all of the network that actually has a strong effect on the H-index. Now, it's debatable whether collaborators self-citations are indeed self-citation or deviant behavior. I guess it's all a matter of perspective. Now, a couple of correlates of self-references. So what are the groups and let's say age group and genders that are more likely to self-cite themselves more? So what external citations here shows is that basically for all domains, researchers that self-cite themselves a lot are also receiving a lot of external citations. So not only they're citing themselves a lot, but they're also cited a lot by others, which could suggest that they're actually doing good work. And so they're cited by others, but they also rely on their so-called good work. Men are much more likely to self-cite themselves. So that's something that we've seen in other work, and I'll show it in another form. And then older researchers, and again, controlling for age, older researchers are more likely to self-cite their work than the younger cohort. And I'm sorry, it's not controlling for age. I mean controlling for number of publications. So for a younger researcher who has authored 30 publications and an older researcher who has authored 30 publications, the older researchers in general are more likely to self-cite their own work than the younger generations. So that's something that was a bit surprising, because we would have thought that younger researchers were more affected by the evaluation culture that is pervasive nowadays, and therefore maybe to have these let's say, potentially deviant behavior. Just another way to represent self-citation by gender. And this again, I think is quite telling. So on the x-axis, you have the total number of citations, and on the y-axis, the percentage of self-citations. So you see that it rises very quickly and then kind of plateaus, but it plateaus at a different percentage for men and women. So basically, irrespective of their total number of citations, men will always have a higher proportion of self-citations than women. And that's just the citation that are gained, just another way of representing. Now moving to the similarity analysis. And so of course the similarity analysis here is based on abstracts because we don't have the full text of those papers. So out of the 63 million articles, 26 million had an abstract and at least one disambiguated author, which has led to basically 15 million pairs of cited article. Now, given the permutation effect of the many authors of the citing and the many authors of the cited paper, it led to basically 1.7 billion comparison with the unique authors. when we started to do that, we were trying to do the abstract comparison on these 1.7 billion pairs using our own servers. It was not possible. So we basically went on the cloud, and it took like a week or so to process that. So this is something that was actually quite heavy here. From a technical point of view, without going to the detail, we really basically processed the text of the abstract, removed stop words, took the stem root of every word, and then we use a TF-IDF representation of every abstract to get the cosine, and then obtain the cosine similarity of each pairs of cited articles. There's a limitation to that, which is that it doesn't take so much the context of sentences into account. So the similarity is indeed the words that are there, but the order and the meaning and all of that is not really taken into account. And so, yeah, I think that's unfortunately a limitation. And then we compare the average similarity score for each citation type for each author. So what do we see here? Well, we actually see that external citations are the most dissimilar to this. So the external citations, external references, they're the most dissimilar between citing and cited papers. Collaborator citations are a bit more similar. And then direct citations, so authors that actually cite their previous work. This is where the text of the abstracts of the two documents were the most similar. And this was true in the three broad domains, so natural sciences, social sciences, and health sciences. It was also invariant as a function of the age of authors. Basically, be it young or old authors, we would see that direct citations are the most similar, collaborators are in between, and then externals are the ones that look the less relevant. And same regarding the age of the cited document. This is interesting because you actually see that similarity decrease over time, which of course could be expected. So more contemporary cited pairs use the same vocabulary, while citing a paper from 20 years ago, well, vocabulary has changed over time, and therefore it's more likely to be dissimilar. But even then, we see the three categories with, again, direct citations being the most similar, although the distance between the curves kind of tend to decrease over time, especially in health sciences and social sciences. Now, I'm actually not so happy with this representation, but basically what it tends to suggest, because we're trying to say, okay, because in that case, you got that our hypothesis kind of got disproved. So our hypothesis was that self-citations would be the most dissimilar because researchers would cite work that is less related. That's not the case. We're not finding that at all. But then we said, okay, but maybe for a subset of authors, so those that self-cite themselves the most, maybe we see something. And indeed, there seems to, our preliminary analysis seems to suggest that those authors who cite self the most, and also who self-cite the least, but let's focus on those who self-cite the most, are the ones where the similarity between citing and cited papers is the lowest. So that kind of suggests a deviant behavior at those extremes. And last result, similarity as a function of gender. Again, this is not so surprising, but especially in the social sciences, but we do see little differences in health sciences and natural sciences. Men are more likely to self-cite documents that are less similar than women. So the difference is not huge. It's basically 3 percentage points, but it's quite present throughout the entire spectrum. So to conclude, so what did we find? The first element is that self-citation and self-references do follow a totally different path over the course of a career. Self-citations decrease over time, and self-references tend to increase or are stable, but increase, especially for highly productive researchers. And so this is a distinction that no one had analyzed yet, and I think that that's actually quite interesting. Self-references are more common for younger documents, which again makes sense because researchers know what they've written in the past. External citations are correlated with self-citation, which means that those who again self-cite a lot are also cited a lot by others. Direct self-citations have little effect on the H-index. So direct self-citation that's not really something, again, that researchers can get rich with, but citations from collaborators contribute in quite an important manner to the H-index. Women are self-referencing less, and again, this is something that converges with a lot of previous research at the paper level. And older researchers are citing themselves more, which can come to us as a surprise. So basically that shows that there's really mechanical aspect to self-citation and self-references. And that, to summarize here, researchers of different fields, but also of different cohorts, cannot be held to the same standard. So expected value of self-citations for older scholars cannot be the same as those for younger scholars. In a way, we as a scientific community could tolerate higher self-citation level for younger scholars, but for older scholars, we should have, let's say, a lower tolerance here. And the last point is that contrary to our hypothesis, and I would say my hypothesis because my co-authors were not as surprised as I was by the results. So I think they're a bit just more clever. But yeah, self-references are just more closer or more relevant to the citing paper than non-self-citations. This is especially true for references that are made by no one. And again, when we were discussing the results, it can be due to several things. The fact that one researcher will use the same vocabulary over time, even maybe when not talking about exactly the same thing, the way things are going to be written, the use of words will be the same. So taking that into account, maybe it's not that surprising. But globally, given that result, it kind of suggests that self-citations are in most cases just a normal feature of knowledge accumulation. But we really need to do more research on the subset of those deviant, highly self-referencing authors to see whether we see something in there. So on that, I thank you very much. And of course, I'm very happy to answer and debate and discuss all of those results. Thank you.